The trail had been Nadia's idea, which meant that when things started going wrong, Marcus was absolutely going to remind her of that fact. Not that anything was going wrong yet. The four of them had been hiking for 3 hours through the Blackwater State Forest in northern Florida, following a trail that Nadia had found on an old topographic map she'd downloaded from a geology survey website. A trail that was not on any current hiking app and not marked on any sign at the trailhead parking lot, and that Nadia had described with the particular enthusiasm she reserved for things that other people considered bad ideas as an adventure. Marcus had looked at the map on her phone and pointed out that the trail appeared to lead nowhere specific, just deeper into a section of forest that the current maps showed as featureless green. Nadia had said that was exactly the point. Marcus had looked at their other two companions, Danny and Priya, for support, and Danny had shrugged in the way that Danny shrugged at everything, which was with his whole body, and an expression of cheerful resignation. And Priya had already started adjusting her backpack straps for the hike, which Marcus had learned over 3 years of friendship meant the decision was made and his input was noted and appreciated and irrelevant. So here they were, 3 hours into the Blackwater State Forest on a Tuesday in October during fall break, the four of them, because Marcus had ultimately packed his bag and gotten in Nadia's car, because the alternative was spending fall break in his apartment, watching Danny's Netflix account, and that was somehow worse. He'd been roommates with Danny since freshman year, which was how he'd met the other two. Danny and Nadia had grown up in the same neighborhood in Asheville, North Carolina, and they had the particular ease of people who had known each other through the uncomfortable years of early adolescence and had arrived at adulthood still liking each other, which Marcus respected because he knew from experience that it was rarer than it looked. Priya had been Nadia's lab partner in intro biology sophomore year and had been absorbed into the group with the quiet inevitability of a person who fitted a space you hadn't realized was empty. Marcus had been the last piece of the four, or possibly the first, depending on how you counted, since he and Danny had lived together first and the girls had come later, and the four of them as a unit had solidified over 2 years of studying together and cooking bad meals together, and taking road trips together that invariably involved Nadia finding something on a map that no one else had heard of, and the rest of them following her into it. He was used to following her into things. He was not always glad he had, but he was used to it. The forest in October in the Florida Panhandle was not what most people pictured when they pictured Florida. There were no beaches here, no palm trees, no particular warmth. The Blackwater was longleaf pine and scrub oak, and creek bottoms thick with cypress, the ground sandy and pale where it wasn't choked with undergrowth, the sky mostly invisible above the canopy except in patches. The air smelled like pine resin and creek water, and the particular dry sweetness of fallen pine needles baking in whatever sun made it through the canopy. The temperature was in the mid-60s, cool enough that Marcus was glad he'd brought a layer warm enough that the hiking kept him comfortable without overheating. It was, he had to admit privately and without any intention of saying so out loud, a genuinely beautiful place to be on a Tuesday in October. His campus in Tallahassee was 40 minutes south, close enough that they hadn't needed to take a full day to get here. They'd left at 8, hit the trailhead by 9, been in the trees by 9:15. And Marcus had spent the first hour walking in a state of gradually diminishing resistance to the fact that this had been a good idea, the tension of the previous week's midterms bleeding out of his shoulders in direct proportion to the distance from the parking lot. He was a junior biology pre-med carrying 18 credit hours and a part-time job at the campus health center where he did administrative work 3 evenings a week. He was by the objective measure of how much he slept and how often he remembered to eat actual food rather than whatever was fastest somewhat overextended. And the walk through the October forest was doing things for his nervous system that no amount of coffee or study breaks had been able to do all semester. He had stopped resenting Nadia for the trail approximately 40 minutes in, and was currently somewhat grateful for it, though he maintained the position internally that the right call had been to push back. Because someone in the group had to be the person who pushed back, or they would all end up in increasingly impractical situations indefinitely, which in a group with Nadia in it was a genuine concern. Nadia was 20 feet ahead of everyone else as usual, her red backpack visible through the trees, her dark hair pulled up under a cap, moving through the undergrowth with the ease of someone who had grown up doing this. She was from Western North Carolina, originally one of those people who had been put on trails before she could reliably walk on flat ground, and her relationship with the outdoors had a fluency that Marcus found both admirable and slightly annoying when he was tired, and she was not. She was a geography major with a secondary focus in cartography, which explained why she spent time downloading geological survey maps from federal databases for fun. And she had the spatial reasoning of someone who had grown up reading terrain rather than street signs. Danny was beside Marcus, which was where Danny generally positioned himself, close enough to someone he trusted to maintain a conversation without having to think too hard about navigation. Danny was 6'2" and broad-shouldered, and had the look of someone who could carry large things over long distances, which was in fact his primary contribution on trips like this, since his sense of direction was famously terrible, and his tolerance for insects was famously low. He was an engineering student, mechanical, with a talent for building physical things and a corresponding indifference to biological ones. And he had come on this trip primarily because the alternative was staying in their apartment, where his girlfriend had broken up with him 3 weeks ago, and every object in it reminded him of something. Marcus had not pointed this out to him. Danny had not mentioned it. They had packed the car in companionable silence, and that had been that. He was currently examining his forearm with an expression of profound personal offense. "Something bit me," he announced. "Something is always biting you," Priya said from behind them without looking up from her phone, which she was using to photograph a patch of carnivorous plants she'd found growing in a low wet spot beside the trail. "I'm serious this time," Danny said. "It left a mark." "They all leave marks," Priya said. Marcus looked at Danny's arm. There was a small red welt there that looked entirely consistent with a standard insect bite. He said so. Danny made a face that suggested he required more sympathy than Marcus was providing, and pulled his sleeve down and kept walking. Priya was a biology major with a specialty interest in plant ecology, and she treated every field trip as an opportunity for research, which the others had long since accepted as a fixed feature of hiking with her. She moved at the back of the group because the back of the group was where the interesting things were, the things the people in front had walked past without noticing. The low plants and the soil composition and the insect life and the evidence of animal passage that accumulated at the margins of the trail rather than in the center of it. She had a camera and a phone and a small notebook and a set of sample vials in her pack, and she used all of them, and the hikes that Priya came on tended to take longer than the hikes that Priya did not come on, which was fine with everyone because the things she found and explained on the way made the time worth it. She had spent 20 minutes at the carnivorous plant patch, explaining the mechanism by which the plants supplemented their nitrogen intake in the nutrient-poor sandy soil of the longleaf pine ecosystem. And Danny had asked questions that were more engaged than his usual posture toward biological topics suggested he would be. And Marcus had listened and felt the particular satisfaction of learning something specific about a place while you were standing in it. They had been on the trail for another 40 minutes, and the trail had narrowed to the point where it was more theory than reality, more a suggestion of a path through the undergrowth than an actual cleared route when Nadia stopped. Marcus came up beside her. Through the trees ahead, maybe 100 yards off the trail, he could see something that was not a tree. Something large and angular, and the particular color of old metal, visible in pieces through the undergrowth as the breeze moved the branches. "What is that?" Danny said, coming up on Marcus's other side. "I don't know," Nadia said. She was already moving toward it. Marcus said. She was already moving toward it. The four of them pushed through the undergrowth toward the shape. And as they got closer, the shape resolved itself into something that Marcus's brain had been trying to avoid arriving at as a conclusion, because the conclusion was unexpected and strange. It was a fence, a chain-link fence at least 12 feet tall with 3 strands of barbed wire along the top, angled outward. The kind of fence that doesn't get built to keep deer out. The kind of fence that gets built to keep people out or to keep something in. The fence ran in both directions through the trees as far as Marcus could see, and through it they could see more trees, and in the trees they could see buildings. Not large buildings. Low concrete structures, single-story, the kind of utilitarian institutional architecture that government agencies produced in the 1960s and 70s, functional and graceless and built to last rather than to impress. There were 5 of them visible from where Marcus stood, connected by covered walkways whose roofs had partially collapsed under the weight of decades of vegetation. The whole compound had been reclaimed by the forest. To a significant degree, vines covered the lower portions of the fence. Trees had grown up close against the buildings. In one case, a large pine had fallen against the roof of the nearest structure and stayed there, its root ball exposed and its canopy resting on the building's corner, like a drunk leaning against a wall. It had been abandoned for a long time. That was clear from 10 feet away. "Holy," Danny said, which was his way of not finishing sentences. He'd started with a word he was trying to cut back on. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets. and looked at the compound through the fence with the expression of a person whose engineering instincts were firing, assessing structural condition, calculating load-bearing capacity, estimating age from material weathering, he said. 60s construction, maybe early 70s. Look at the aggregate in that concrete that's a mid-century mix. Priya had come up beside Marcus and she was looking at the fence and the buildings with the expression she got when something in the field surprised her, which was rare enough to be notable. She said, "How is this not on any map?" Nadia said it might be. She was pulling her phone out. She said it might be on maps that aren't public. She was looking at her topographic download with a new focus. She said there's a notation on this survey. She showed Marcus the screen. There was a small symbol in the area corresponding to where they were standing. A symbol that Marcus recognized from topographic maps as indicating a structure, but that had no accompanying label. She said I saw it when I downloaded the map, but I thought it was a survey marker or a maintenance facility. She looked through the fence at the compound. She said it's not a maintenance facility. Marcus said no. He said it looking at the fence and the barbed wire and the buildings and the sign he could now see on the nearest building, too far away to read from here, but clearly a sign mounted beside the door, institutional in its size and placement. He said it's really not. Nadia was already moving along the fence line looking for something. Marcus followed because the alternative was standing still and feeling uneasy by himself, which was somehow worse. He watched her hands trail along the fence as she walked, testing the links looking for inconsistency. The fence was old, but it was heavy gauge and it had been maintained at some point. Or at least it had been installed with the intention of being genuinely difficult to breach, the kind of hardware that spoke of a budget that took the perimeter seriously. She found the gap about 40 feet along, a section where the chain link had separated from the post at the bottom, creating a triangular opening at ground level, maybe 2 feet high and 2 feet wide. Large enough for a person to squeeze through if the person was not especially large and was especially motivated. The edges of the gap were not freshly broken. The separation between the link and the post was old, the metal at the break point oxidized and soft-looking, the gap itself partially grown over with low vegetation that had taken root in the disturbed soil at the fence base. The gap had been there for a long time, long enough for plants to colonize it. Nadia crouched and looked through the gap and then looked back at the three of them. Marcus said absolutely not. Danny said, it's definitely trespassing. Priya said the buildings could be structurally unsafe. Nadia said there's a sign on that building. She pointed through the gap at the nearest concrete structure. She said I can't read it from here. Marcus started to say something and stopped because he could see the sign too, and he couldn't read it from here either, and he absolutely wanted to know what it said, and he was furious at himself for wanting to know. He looked at the gap. He looked at the compound. He looked at the sky, which was a clear October blue with no suggestion of weather coming. He thought about how far they were from the trailhead and how much battery was in his phone and whether the emergency beacon on Nadia's pack was accessible. He thought about all of these things as a professional activity, the mental equivalent of checking your equipment before a job, because Marcus was the kind of person who did that, and because doing it made him feel like he had done his due diligence, even when the conclusion he was about to reach was probably not the conclusion due diligence was supposed to produce. He said 5 minutes. We look at the sign, we walk around the outside of the nearest building, we come back. Nadia smiled at him. He recognized the smile as the one that meant she already knew he was going to say yes and had simply been waiting for him to catch up to it. He recognized this and said nothing about it and followed her through the fence. They went through one at a time. Nadia first, then Priya, then Danny, who had to angle himself sideways and scraped his jacket on the bent wire and said something under his breath about the jacket being new. Then Marcus, who went last and stood up on the other side and immediately noticed two things. The first was that the ground inside the fence was different from the ground outside it. Not dramatically, not in a way that would register if you weren't paying attention, but the vegetation was different in composition, the undergrowth lower and less dense, as if the species mix on this side had been influenced over many years by something that was not present on the other side of the fence. The second was the sound, or rather the character of the sound. The forest outside the fence had the ordinary acoustic texture of a functioning woodland ecosystem. Bird song and insect noise and the movement of branches. Inside the fence those sounds were present but diminished, as if the compound existed inside a slight acoustic dampening that had no obvious physical explanation. Marcus stood in it and felt it, and told himself it was his imagination, and followed the others toward the nearest building. The sign beside the door read, United States Army Biological Research Facility, 7, Authorized Personnel Only, Biohazard Protocols in Effect beyond this point. Below the text, the standard biohazard symbol faded to a pale orange, barely distinguishable from the concrete behind it. Below the symbol, a secondary line in smaller text. All personnel must comply with containment protocols at all times. Failure to comply is a federal offense. Marcus read the sign in its entirety. He read it a second time to make sure he had read it correctly the first time. Then he said Biological Research Facility. Nadia said, Cool. He said Biohazard Protocols. Danny said was. Past tense. Look at this place. It's been abandoned for decades. Priya was photographing the sign with her phone. She said, Army Biological Research in a National Forest. She paused, the phone still raised. She said, There's no record of this. She said it with the precision of someone who would know, who had spent enough time in academic databases to have a reliable sense of what was and wasn't documented. She said there should be a record of this. The door beside the sign was metal painted the same institutional green as everything else in the compound, with a push handle rather than a knob. The kind of door built for people moving through quickly with their hands full. It was closed. It was secured with a padlock through a hasp. The padlock large and heavy-duty, the kind designed to resist bolt cutters. Marcus noted this with relief and opened his mouth to say something about moving around the outside of the building as agreed when Nadia pushed the door and it swung open. The padlock was closed through only one side of the hasp. It was not secured to anything. From a distance it looked locked, and it was performing the function of looking locked, and it had been doing this for what appeared to be a considerable period of time. Nadia stood in the open doorway and looked into the building. Marcus came to stand beside her. The smell hit him before anything else registered visually. He had been expecting the smell of a sealed space, the accumulated mustiness of old air and deteriorating materials, the particular stuffiness of a building that had been closed for decades. What came through the open door was not that. It was layered and complex and biological in a way that the simple staleness of old air was not. And it had a quality underneath the top notes, something warm and organic and persistent that his body registered before his brain did. The hairs on his forearms rose, his stomach tightened. He took an involuntary half-step back and then stopped himself and stood his ground and breathed through his mouth for a moment. Priya was beside him. She said that's organic in the voice she used for field observations. She said recent organic. She said not decomposition, that's metabolic. Active metabolic output. Marcus said active. She said relatively. She looked at him and then back at the doorway. She said something is producing that inside the building. Something living, Marcus said. She said yes. Nadia had gone inside. Marcus stood in the doorway for approximately 3 seconds, doing an honest inventory of his options, found that the inventory produced the same result his inventories always produced when Nadia was already inside something and went in. The interior was a single large room divided into smaller spaces by partition walls, most of which had partially collapsed or been removed at some point, leaving the space open and cavernous and difficult to resolve into a coherent floor plan. The floor was concrete, cracked and stained with a drainage channel running down the center that was wider than a standard utility drain. The kind of channel built to handle volume. The walls were institutional green under the grime and the growth of mold that had colonized the lower sections from the floor up to about 4 feet above which the original paint was more visible, faded but intact. The windows were set high in the walls, small and reinforced with wire mesh embedded in the glass, most of them intact, admitting a gray filtered light that gave the space the quality of being underwater. There were cages. Marcus absorbed this fact slowly because his brain wanted to process the room's other features first and keep the cages for later. But the cages were the dominant feature, and they could not be kept for later. They were large floor-to-ceiling constructed of heavy-gauge steel mesh on steel frames that had been bolted to the floor and ceiling with hardware that Marcus recognized from his father's industrial construction background as the kind used in facilities where the structural attachment of equipment was load-bearing in a safety-critical sense. There were 12 of them, 6 on each side of the room, and they were built for large animals. The scale of them was clear from the door size, from the feed hardware still visible in the mesh walls, from the dimensions of the interior space. Whatever had lived in these cages had been the size of a large dog at minimum, and likely larger. Danny had come in behind Marcus and was standing in the center of the room, looking at the cages with the expression of someone doing engineering calculations they would prefer not to be doing. He said, "Heavy gauge, that's at least 11 gauge mesh." He said those frames are welded, not bolted. He walked along the row of cages, touching the frames as he passed them with the professional familiarity of someone who understood structural metalwork. He said someone spent serious money on these. He said this isn't agricultural or veterinary grade. He paused at one of the cages midway along the left row. He said, "Look at this one." Marcus came to look. The mesh on the cage Danny was pointing at was deformed on the interior wall, the wire bent outward in a pattern that was not consistent with impact from outside. It was consistent with sustained pressure from inside, something pushing against the mesh with enough force over enough time to deform the wire without breaking it. The welds at the corners of the frame were stressed but intact. Whatever had pushed against the mesh from inside had not gotten through. The deformation suggested it had tried. He moved to the far end of the room. The large cage in the far corner was different from the others, substantially larger, and its mesh had not merely deformed, it had been breached. A section of the wall near the base of the cage, maybe 2 feet wide and 18 inches high, had been opened outward, the mesh cut or broken, and bent back to create an opening. The edges of the breach were sharp and uneven, and the frame at the breach point had been partially torn from the floor, mounting the bolts still in the concrete, but the frame itself pulled to a 45-degree angle. Danny came to stand beside Marcus and looked at the breach. He said that went through going out. He said the way the mesh is bent, the way the frame is pulled. He said whatever made that opening was inside the cage and wanted to be outside the cage. He looked at the floor in front of the breach. The concrete there was stained with something dark that was not rust. An old stain, dry and covered in grime, but large, spreading from the breach area toward the drainage channel in the center of the room. He said, "Okay." Marcus said, "Okay." They looked at each other for a moment. Priya was at a partition remnant between 2 cages photographing something on the wall. She had found what remained of a chart or schedule. The lamination failed and the paper beneath moisture damaged but partially legible. She was reading it with the focused attention of someone extracting data from a damaged source. She said these are measurements. She said body mass temperature. Something I can't read, and dates. She said the dates run from 1974 to 1988. She said 8 subjects listed by number. She said the measurements change significantly over the date range. Marcus said how significantly. She said the mass measurements for some of the subjects more than double between the earliest and latest dates. She looked at him. She said whatever was in these cages was growing during the period covered by this chart. Marcus said, "And then what?" She said the chart ends in 1988. She said there's nothing after 1988. Marcus looked at the breach in the large cage. He looked at the drainage channel in the floor. He looked at the smell still coming from somewhere deeper in the building, the warm, organic, metabolic smell that Priya had identified as active. He said we should go. Nadia was at the far wall where there was a door. Of course she was. The door was metal set into the wall with a placard beside it that read, "Sector 7 Research Corridor, Level 2. Clearance required." Below this, in the same official font, a line that had been partially obscured by moisture damage but was still legible. "Proceed only with authorized escort." Nadia said there's more of this. She said it with the wonder of someone who has found a room behind a bookcase, genuine and immediate, and entirely undiminished by context. She said a whole other section. Marcus said Nadia. She looked at him. He looked at the placard. He looked at her. He looked at the cage with the breach in it. He looked at the drainage channel. He thought about what Priya had said. He thought about the smell. He said 5 more minutes. He heard himself say it and recognized the sound of a person who has decided something while telling himself he hasn't decided yet. He said we look at the corridor, we do not go far, and at the first sign of structural instability, we come straight back. Nadia pushed through the door, and the smell that came through the door from the corridor beyond was significantly worse than the smell in the cage room. Marcus noted this, filed it in the category of information that was not going to change his immediate course of action because Nadia was already through the door and followed her. The corridor was long, longer than the building above them should have been able to contain, which meant it extended either underground or laterally into an adjacent structure through a connection that was not visible from outside. The ceiling was low, 8 feet, with fluorescent fixtures running down the center. Most were dark and dead, their tubes blackened or broken, but a scattered few were still operational, running on some residual power source that should by any reasonable calculation have been exhausted decades ago, producing a sick, yellowish light that made the skin of everyone in the corridor look the color of old paper. The floor was concrete, with drainage channels wider than the ones in the cage room, and along the base of the walls on both sides ran pipe conduits and cable runs, the infrastructure of a facility that had been designed to move fluids and data in quantity. Marcus looked at the pipe conduits and thought about what kind of building needed that scale of fluid handling infrastructure. And the answer was the kind of building where the things happening inside it were consistently, systematically messy. On the walls between the dead fixtures were placards. Marcus read them as he walked because reading them gave his mind something specific to do, and a specific mind was harder to frighten than a general one. Containment Protocol Alpha C Manual SOP 7 A4 Full Procedures Decontamination required before exit from this corridor. Specimen handling, all contact, requires Level 3 PPE. Report all unusual behavior to Shift Supervisor immediately. Do not attempt independent assessment. He said to Danny, "What do you think they were doing here?" Danny said the sign said biological research. Marcus said what kind. Danny said the kind they don't put in the public record. He paused. He said in the 1980s. He paused again. He said in a building in a national forest with 12 large animal cages and a corridor that smells like that. He looked at Marcus. He said, "I took a bioethics elective last semester." Marcus said, "I know." Danny said, "Yeah." They walked in silence for a moment. Nadia and Priya were ahead of them, moving from door to door along the corridor. Some doors opened and some did not. Through the ones that opened, a utility room with overturned shelving and broken glass on the floor. A small office with a desk still in place, its surface clear. A coffee mug still sitting on the corner of the desk as if someone had stepped out for 10 minutes in 1988 and simply not come back. A storage room with industrial shelving along all 4 walls. the shelving empty, the floor beneath it stained with the residue of whatever had previously been stored there. Chemical stains in a range of colors that suggested a range of contents. A room that was entirely taken over by root growth, a tree that had found a crack in the wall decades ago and sent its roots through and expanded them until the room was more root than room, the pale-knuckled wood filling the space with an organic density that was almost beautiful and entirely suffocating. Through another door, what had been an operating theater. The overhead surgical light still in position above the central table. The light dead, but the arm assembly intact. The articulated joints seized with rust, but the general form preserved. The table itself had restraint hardware still in place. Heavy-duty loops and clasps at the head, the waist, the wrists and ankles, sized for something larger than a standard adult human. The size of the restraints was the thing Marcus could not look at for long, and could not stop looking at the gap between the size they implied and the size of the humans who would have been in this room, performing whatever was performed in this room. He looked at the wall instead. There was a whiteboard there. Unlike the other surfaces in the corridor, it had been protected, covered at some point with a sheet of heavy plastic sheeting stapled across it. The plastic yellowed and brittle-edged, but mostly intact. Through the plastic, the marker text on the board was legible. It was a list. 8 items numbered each, a brief notation in the clipped technical language of someone making field observations quickly. Marcus read them in order, while Priya photographed the board. 1 accelerated tissue repair observed laceration closure within 6 hours. 2 enhanced sensory acuity confirmed photoreceptor sensitivity significantly increased. Strong light aversion developing. 3 conditioning responses, no longer reliable behavioral modification protocols suspended. 4 locomotion pattern adapting bipedal stability, decreasing alternative movement pattern emerging. 5 vocalizations no longer consistent with species, baseline new acoustic range documented. 6 dietary requirements changed, standard provision refused, alternative provision accepted. 7. Containment breach Sector B specimen recovered all cages, reinforced per emergency protocol. 8. Subject status unknown, monitoring equipment. Failure assessment suspended pending equipment repair. Below the 8 items in different handwriting, larger and written with a different marker, darker and pressed harder into the surface. 2 words, do not open. Marcus read the list twice. He said there were 12 cages in the room we came through. Priya said yes. He said, this list covers 8 subjects. She said yes. He said, so what happened to the other 4? She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the list and then at him and then at the list again. She said, I don't know. She said the list might be incomplete. She said there may have been subjects that were handled differently through a different documentation system. She said all of this, and her voice was level, and the field observation register was intact. But her eyes were doing something that was not consistent with the field observation register, and Marcus read it and chose not to say anything about it. He said item 7. Specimen recovered after containment breach. He said, what does that tell us? She said that at some point one of the subjects got out and they got it back. He said item 8, status unknown, monitoring suspended. She said that at some point after that they lost track of one of them and didn't get it back. He said, and then the facility closed in 1991. She said yes. He said, and they left. She didn't answer that. Nadia was in the doorway. She said, "Guys." Her voice had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would register as fear from someone who didn't know her, but Marcus knew her, and it registered. He turned. In the corridor outside the operating theater, one of the fluorescent fixtures that had been working was no longer working. The pool of light it had cast was gone. The corridor was darker than it had been when they walked through it. Marcus looked at the dark section of corridor, approximately 30 feet of it, between the functioning fixture they were standing under and the next one further down, and he looked at it with the specific attention of someone who has just read a list on a whiteboard and is now trying to calculate the significance of a light going out. He said the bulb burned out. Nadia said maybe. He said those things go out all the time. She said I know. Neither of them looked away from the dark section. Priya said, "Where's Danny?" Marcus turned around. The operating theater was lit by Priya's phone flashlight and the gray ambient light from the door, and Danny was not in it. He looked back at the corridor. The sections that were still lit were empty. He said, "Danny." No answer. He said it louder. The corridor carried the sound in both directions and brought nothing back. From somewhere further along the corridor in the direction they hadn't explored, a sound. Not a word. A syllable or the start of one. The sound a person makes when the language processing center shuts down temporarily in response to something the visual cortex has sent up that it cannot categorize. It came from the direction of the dark. They moved toward it. The three of them, Priya leading with her phone flashlight, Marcus and Nadia close behind. Marcus watched the walls as he moved the habit of construction site experience applied to a situation it had not been designed for. He watched where the ceiling met the walls. He watched the drainage channels in the floor. He watched the doors they passed on both sides, all of them closed, all of them inert. He watched the dark ahead of Priya's light, and he saw nothing in it, and he noted that seeing nothing in it was not the same as nothing being in it. Danny was at the T-intersection where the main corridor split into two branches. He was standing at the center of the intersection facing down the right branch, and he was standing very still in the way that large people stand when stillness has been chosen rather than arrived at a deliberate and considered stillness. He didn't turn when they came up beside him. He said, without looking away from the right branch, something went down there. Marcus looked down the right branch. Darker than the main corridor, most of the fixtures here dead with a faint greenish emergency light visible around a corner at the far end, the kind of light that has been running on battery backup for so long the battery is delivering the very last of what it has. He could see 30 feet of corridor, and then the dark took it. He said, "What did you see?" Danny said, "I followed the corridor to the intersection because I wanted to see if there was another exit." He stopped. He said, "When I got here, something at the far end of the right branch moved." He paused again. He said it was moving away from me, away from the light. He said it was big. Priya said, "Big how?" Danny said big in the way that I'm not going to try to quantify, because if I try to quantify it, I'm going to have to say something that I don't want to say in a hallway, in a building that smells like this. He looked at Marcus. He said the way it moved was wrong. Marcus said wrong how? Danny said wrong like the list on that whiteboard back there is making more sense to me now than it did when I read it. He said wrong like locomotion pattern, adapting bipedal stability, decreasing alternative movement pattern, emerging. He said, remember that one. He looked at Marcus. He said, I remember that one. They stood at the intersection for a moment. The smell was stronger here, the warm, metabolic, organic smell, concentrated and layered, and underneath it now something else, something that Marcus had not been able to identify before, and was now able to identify only because his body was identifying it independently of his brain, producing in him a series of physical responses that his brain was receiving as data elevated heart rate, muscle tension in the shoulders and calves, a clarity of attention that pushed everything peripheral to the edge of awareness and filled the center with the immediate and the spatial. He was afraid. He was afraid in the specific and calibrated way of someone whose nervous system has concluded that the current environment contains something that poses a direct threat, and he respected this conclusion because he trusted his nervous system and because the evidence available to him was consistent with it. He said, "We go back." He said it with the authority of someone who has made a decision and is not accepting counter-arguments. He said we go back through the main corridor, through the cage room, out the front door, through the fence back to the trail. He said now. Nobody argued. This was itself significant. When a group that includes Nadia doesn't produce a counter-argument, the situation has reached a threshold. They turned back toward the main corridor. Marcus was in the lead this time, and he was moving fast, the controlled fast of someone who has decided not to run, because running in an unfamiliar environment is its own category of risk, but covering ground at the maximum speed that controlled movement allowed. The main corridor extended back the way they had come. The operating theater door on the left, the junction with the entrance corridor ahead. He could see the functional lights, the yellow fluorescent patches, and he moved toward them. The lights went out. Not all of them. 3 or 4 that had been working in the section of main corridor between Marcus and the entrance went dark in sequence, not simultaneously. 1, then the next, then the next, as if something moving through that section of corridor was interacting with them as it passed the lights, responding to a presence moving in their direction toward Marcus. The darkness advancing light by light toward where he stood. Marcus stopped walking. His feet stopped before he consciously chose to stop, and he stood in the last functioning light in the corridor, and he looked at the dark ahead of him, and he understood with the clarity that comes when multiple streams of evidence arrive at the same conclusion simultaneously that something was between him and the exit. Priya's phone flashlight came forward past his shoulder and lit the corridor, and Marcus saw it. It was standing in the corridor, standing or something that was the current iteration of what standing had become for this thing. Over 30 years of adaptation in an underground facility in a national forest in northern Florida. It was upright, and its weight was on its lower limbs, and it occupied the vertical dimension of the corridor in a way that was consistent with a prior familiarity with bipedal posture. But the posture had been modified by time and biology, and whatever the process was that had been running in this body since 1988, into something that shared the skeleton of standing without sharing any of its particulars. It was large. The corridor was 8 feet high, and the thing filled most of that height and most of the width. And in the beam of Priya's flashlight, it had a surface that absorbed the light, rather than reflecting it a matte density of darkness that the flashlight beam penetrated to a depth of perhaps 2 inches before the absorption took it. In the location of the face area, the region of the thing where a face would be if the thing had completed the transition from whatever it had been to whatever it was now, there were 2 points of reflected light. The eyes. They were positioned correctly for a face in the sense of being on the approximate front of the thing, at approximately the height where eyes would be. And they were reflecting Priya's flashlight in the specific way that eyes reflect light, with the unmistakable retinal return that makes eyes visible in darkness from a distance. But the positioning was wrong. The distance between them was wrong. The angle was wrong. The shape of the reflection was wrong, not round, not ovoid. Something that Marcus's pattern recognition kept trying to resolve into a known shape and kept failing. The thing in the corridor made a sound. He could not describe the sound in any category he had a name for. It was not a growl, it was not a scream, it was not a vocalization he had any prior reference for. His body received it as a signal and processed it in the most ancient part of the threat assessment architecture, below language, below rational evaluation, directly at the level of survive or don't. Every hair on his body rose, every muscle in his legs contracted. He ran left. He ran left into the unexplored branch, because the explored branch was where the thing was, and the alternative to left was standing still, and standing still was not an option his body was willing to consider. He heard the others behind him, and he heard something else behind the others. Heavier and wrong-footed and fast in the specific way of something that is fast, despite the wrongness of its movement, and he ran. The left branch was short. It ended at double doors metal with push bars, the kind of emergency exit hardware that opens under applied pressure. Marcus hit them with both forearms at speed, and they opened, and the space beyond was large and dark, and Marcus went into it, and the others came through behind him, and he turned and pushed the doors closed, and the push bars engaged from this side, and held. The impact from the other side came approximately 2 seconds later. A single concussive hit that rattled both doors in their frames and sent a vibration through the push bars that Marcus felt in his forearms and chest and sternum. The doors held, then silence from the other side. Marcus stood with his back against the doors and breathed for 20 seconds. He counted the seconds. Counting was something to do with his brain, while the rest of him caught up to having stopped running. He looked at the room they were in. It was a laboratory, a real one built and equipped with the seriousness of a facility that was doing real science, the kind of science that required benches with integrated plumbing and gas lines and electrical outlets at 2-foot intervals. the kind that required a ventilation system in the ceiling massive enough to handle the products of chemical and biological processes. The benches were still in place, their surfaces scarred and stained from use. The equipment that had occupied the housings long removed, but the housings themselves intact. Along one wall, floor-to-ceiling shelving still held glass and plastic containers, most empty, a few with dried residues at their bottoms. Dark concentrations of substances that had once been solutions and were now just evidence that solutions had existed. Along another wall, a bank of what had been computer systems, the systems themselves reduced to empty racks and dangling cables, the displays and drives removed, but the mounting hardware still in place. The ghosts of a data collection system that had been cataloging something in this facility for the duration of its operation. There were windows in this room, large ones set into the far wall. Real exterior windows, sealed fixed panes, but facing outward, facing the trees. Through them, Marcus could see the forest in the afternoon light, October light, pale and golden, and coming through the trees at an angle that meant it was probably around 3 in the afternoon, which meant they had been in the building for less than an hour. Less than an hour. It felt like longer. Priya was beside him. She said the thing in the corridor. Her voice was level in the field observation register, the emotion managed below the surface of the register, but not invisible if you knew where to look, and Marcus knew where to look. She said, "I had the flashlight on it for a few seconds." She said, "I want to tell you what I saw because I think it's important and I think you should hear it now rather than later." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Its hands." She said, "I saw its hands in the flashlight beam, the lower limbs, the distal portion." She said the structure was recognizable as derived from a mammalian forelimb. 5 digits. Correct articulation points. She said, but the proportions were wrong in ways that were consistent with extended adaptation to a specific use pattern. She said the nails were not nails, she said, not like a diseased nail or a broken nail. Different, adapted differently. She looked at him steadily and said, "I want you to understand that I'm describing what I observed, and I'm describing it accurately." He said, "I know." She said, "Item 4 on the list. Locomotion pattern adapting bipedal stability decreasing." She said that notation was made at some point before 1988. She said it's been 35 years since that notation. She said 35 years of continued adaptation with no human intervention and no external pressure except survival in an enclosed underground space. He said, "And that's what we just saw." She said, "That's what we just saw." From the other side of the double doors, a sound. Not the impact of before, something slower, something that moved along the door surface in a systematic way, touching the edge of the door at the top and working down methodical patient. Testing. The sound of something that understood the concept of a door and was examining this specific door with the intent of understanding it. Marcus crossed to Nadia, who was at the far wall at the windows. He said, "Can we get through these?" She said the frame on the right one. She pressed her fingers into the lower corner of the rightmost window, and the frame moved not much, a quarter inch. The seal cracked and broken. She said it's separated from the wall. She said the moisture has gotten into the frame mounting over the years. She pressed again. The frame moved a half inch. She said if we hit it together. Danny had come to stand beside her. He looked at the frame, assessing it with the professional attention of someone who understood structural connections, and he said, "Lower right corner is the failure point." He said if we drive force through the lower right corner, the rest of the frame will follow. He looked at Marcus. He said all three of us. The sound at the double doors stopped. The silence from the other side of the doors was different from the silence before. The previous silence had been passive. This silence was the silence of something that has finished its assessment and is in the process of acting on its conclusions. Marcus had enough experience with the difference between those two kinds of silence to know which this was. He said on 3. 1. He positioned himself at the lower right corner of the window frame, with his shoulder forward and his feet set. 2. Danny took the upper section of the frame. Nadia had both palms on the left side of the frame to direct the swing. Something hit the double doors. Not the full impact of before, something smaller and more precise, lower on the door near the floor level, testing a specific point. 3. The frame gave. The lower right corner separated from the wall and the window swung outward on the remaining upper attachment, and the October air came in pine resin and creek water, and the particular sweetness of fallen needles, and it hit Marcus in the face with the force of every ordinary thing in the world, all of it arriving simultaneously. And he felt something in his chest that was not quite relief, because they were not out yet, but was the direction of relief. Priya was through first, then Nadia. Marcus went third and turned to help Danny, who was going through sideways because of his shoulders, and who cleared the frame and landed in the pine straw outside, and turned and said, "Go." Marcus went, and they ran through the trees away from the building, the fence ahead, the gap ahead. The trail beyond the fence and the parking lot beyond the trail and the car beyond the parking lot and the highway beyond the car and everything ordinary beyond the highway. They went through the fence gap and kept running. Marcus ran until his body told him it had covered enough distance, and then he stopped and put his hands on his knees and breathed and looked at what was around him, which was trees and pine straw and late afternoon light and nothing else. He looked behind them. Nothing at the fence gap. The compound was visible through the trees, but still. The building they had exited was a building concrete and old and inert-looking. He counted the people around him. Nadia, Danny. He said Priya. Nadia was already turning. Danny was already counting. The three of them looking at the space where Priya should have been, and finding it occupied only by trees. Marcus called her name. The forest returned the sound to him, modified by distance and tree density, and gave him nothing else. He called again. Nadia called with him. Danny, who had a voice built for volume, called with both of them, and the call went out into the October forest, and for 3 seconds there was nothing. And then there was crashing through the undergrowth 30 feet to their left, the sound of someone moving fast through vegetation, not designed to be moved through quickly. Branches snapping and palmetto leaves slapping, and Priya came through a stand of scrub palmetto and stopped in front of them. She was breathing very hard. Her hat was gone. There was a long scratch along her forearm, not a cut, a scratch, a line of abraded skin with beads of blood along it. She looked at all three of them, and then looked at the scratch, and then looked at them again. She said, "I went the wrong way through the fence. Left instead of right," she said. "I had to go around the far side of the perimeter to find the gap." Marcus said, "You're okay." She said, "Yes." He said, "What happened to your arm?" She looked at the scratch. She looked at the fence through the trees. She looked at her arm again. She said, "I went through some palmetto." Marcus looked at the scratch. He looked at Priya's face while she was looking at her arm. He said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay." He said, "We need to get moving." They found the trail in the fading light, and Marcus set the pace ahead of everyone, moving fast and not looking back at the forest and not speaking until they were at the trailhead parking lot and Nadia's car was in front of them. He looked at all four of them standing beside the car in the parking lot in the late afternoon. He counted 4. He said everyone in the car, and everyone got in the car. On the drive out at the point where the access road met the state highway, and the forest was fully behind them, and the highway was ahead, Danny said from the back seat, "I need someone to tell me that scratch on Priya's arm is from the palmetto." Marcus looked in the rearview mirror. Priya was in the back seat beside Danny, and she was looking at her arm with an expression that was not consistent with looking at a scratch from a plant. Nadia said, "Priya." Priya said the palmetto was after I went through the gap. Her voice was in the field observation register, precise and level. She said, "Before the palmetto, I felt something catch my ankle at the base of the fence on the inside of the fence." She said, "I pulled away and ran and went left, and the palmetto was after." She looked at her arm. She said, "The scratch is from after." She looked up at the mirror and found Marcus's eyes in it. She said, "What caught my ankle at the fence was not palmetto." Marcus looked at the road. The highway lights came on ahead of them as the dusk deepened one after another in a line leading away from the forest, and he drove toward them. He said, "We're going to the hospital first." She said, "Marcus, it's a scratch." He said, "We're going to the hospital first." Nobody argued. In the emergency room waiting area after Priya had been seen and the scratch had been cleaned and dressed and the on-call physician had said with the careful neutrality of someone who has made an observation they have chosen not to pursue, that it appeared to be an animal contact, but that the profile was unusual, and he would recommend a follow-up in 48 hours. Marcus sat in a plastic chair with bad vending machine coffee and his phone, and searched for Blackwater State Forest Biological Research Facility Army. The results were limited. A reference in a declassified FOIA index to a joint program operated by the Army and an unnamed federal agency in the Florida Panhandle between 1974 and 1989. A notation in a Forest Service land use record indicating that 43 acres of Blackwater State Forest had been under special use permit to the Department of Defense from 1972 to 1991, permit not renewed. Land returned to Forest Service management. A brief entry in a 1991 congressional record of military facility closures that listed among decommissioned installations BRF-7, Blackwater, SFFL, status decommissioned, disposition of assets completed, disposition of assets completed. Marcus read that line several times. He thought about the 12 cages. He thought about the 8 subjects on the list and the 4 cages with no corresponding list entries. He thought about Item 7 containment breach specimen, recovered cage reinforcement ordered. He thought about Item 8, behavioral status, unknown, monitoring, suspended pending equipment repair. He thought about what it meant to leave a facility in 1991 with monitoring equipment that had failed and at least one subject whose status was unknown, and to note in the official record that the disposition of assets was completed. He thought about what they had seen in the corridor, what it had looked like 35 years after the last entry on a research chart that had ended in 1988. Danny came and sat beside him and looked at the phone screen. He said completed. Marcus said that's what it says. Danny said they left them in there. Marcus said I don't know that for certain. Danny said yes you do. Marcus locked his phone. He drank his coffee. The emergency room moved around him in its ordinary rhythms, and he sat in it and felt the distance between himself and ordinary, and found that the distance was larger than he would know what to do with right now, and possibly for some time. Priya came out from the treatment area with Nadia beside her and sat down. She had a clean dressing on her forearm, and she was carrying a printout of aftercare instructions. She sat beside Marcus and said, "The physician asked me what kind of animal I thought it was. She said I told him I wasn't sure. She said, he told me the contact pattern was unusual in that the spacing was consistent with a large hand rather than a paw." She looked at Marcus. She said he said it like he was noting an anomaly and then he moved on. She said I think he moved on because the alternative to moving on was a conversation he didn't have a framework for. Marcus said yeah. She said I don't have a framework for it either. She said that's the thing. I'm a biology major. I understand adaptation. I understand what 35 years of isolated development with strong selective pressure can do to an organism. She said, I can follow the biology of what was in that building all the way from the research program that started in 1974 to what we saw in that corridor tonight. I can follow every step. She said what I can't accommodate is that they left. They did the research, they closed the facility, they drove away, and they left 8 living subjects in sealed underground corridors with no food supply, no light, no human contact, and no way out. She said, and then they wrote in the record that the disposition of assets was completed. She said this, and her voice remained in the field observation register throughout, and Marcus respected this deeply and said nothing for a moment. He said, we're going to make a report. She said, to who? He said, I don't know yet. He said, someone. He said, we have photographs. He said, Nadia has the topographic map with the structure notation. He said, we document what we saw and we submit it to every agency we can identify that might have jurisdiction, and we let them tell us it's not their problem until we find the one that admits it is. She said, and if no one admits it is their problem. He said, then we find someone who will make it their problem. She said, and in the meantime, he looked at her. She looked at him. They both knew what in the meantime meant. In the meantime, the fence had a gap in it, and the gap had been there long enough for plants to grow through it, and whatever was in the corridors under the Blackwater State Forest had been there since 1991, and had been adapting since then, and the facility had no monitoring and no oversight, and the official record said the assets had been disposed of. He said first thing tomorrow. He said it with the conviction of someone who means it and knows that meaning it and being able to act on it are different things and has decided to treat them as the same thing for now because the alternative is paralysis, and paralysis in a plastic emergency room chair at 9 in the evening is not useful to anyone. He meant it when he said it. He still means it. The report was filed 10 days later electronically with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the U.S. Forest Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Defense Health Agency, and a congressional representative whose district included the Blackwater State Forest. Acknowledgement receipts were received from all 5 within 72 hours. In the 5 weeks since, substantive responses have been received from 2. The Forest Service response indicated that the land parcel in question had been returned to General Forest Management in 1991, and that no active federal facilities existed within it. The Army Corps of Engineers response indicated that the facility referenced had been properly decommissioned in accordance with all applicable regulations, and that the disposition of its assets had been completed at the time of decommissioning. Marcus is still waiting to hear from the others. Priya's arm healed without complication. She went back to the campus health center for her 48-hour follow-up, and the physician who had treated her in the emergency room was not on duty that day, and the physician who was on duty reviewed the notes and said it looked like a healing animal scratch, probably a large dog, and sent her home with a clean bill of health. The 4 of them have not gone back to Blackwater State Forest. They will not be going back. 3 weeks after they filed the reports, Nadia checked the trailhead parking lot on a map application. There were 8 vehicles in the lot that had not been there in any previous image in the application's historical archive. Dark-colored, unmarked, the kind of vehicles that are not remarkable until you are looking for a reason to find them remarkable, and then they are extremely remarkable. The vehicles were there for 11 days based on the archive images, and then they were not there, and the parking lot was empty, and the trail was just a trail going into just a forest. Marcus does not know what happened in those 11 days. He has thought carefully about whether he wants to know, and has concluded that he does not. He has concluded that knowing would not produce any action he is in a position to take, and would require him to hold information that he is not currently equipped to hold without it becoming the primary content of his daily life. And he has a semester to finish and a future to build toward, and those things require a person who has decided with full awareness of the decision and the discomfort it involves that some situations are outside the scope of what one undergraduate in Tallahassee can meaningfully act on. He has made his report. He has documented what he found. He has done what he can do from where he is. He thinks sometimes about item 8 on the list. Behavioral status unknown, monitoring suspended pending review. He thinks about what unknown means after 35 years. He thinks about what pending review means when the review never came. He stops thinking about it and goes to class and does his work and lives his life. He keeps his windows closed at night, which is new, and he has not examined this closely enough to explain it to himself in terms that feel adequate, And he is not going to examine it closely because examining it closely is a door he is choosing deliberately and with full awareness not to open. He is getting good at not opening doors. He thinks that might be the most important thing he learned in the Blackwater State Forest. More important than the biology, and more important than the history, and more important than any of the things he saw in those corridors. Some doors are closed for a reason. Leave them that way. BRF 7, Blackwater State Forest, Florida. Operational 1974 to 1991. Official status decommissioned. Disposition of assets completed. 8 subjects documented. Fate of all 8 unrecorded. The fence is still there. The gap in the fence is still there. The forest does not advertise what it keeps.